specifically about gender bias in peer review, particularly in medical sciences, but extrapolating to the sciences more generally. Suggesting that we have good reason to believe that there's gender bias in at least unblinded or non-double-blinded review situations, particularly at higher level funding applications. So just quickly, we know how, you know what I mean when I say blinded and double-blinded peer review. So I'll talk about how it works in philosophy because I know about that more. But so for reviewing, say, journal articles for possible publication, a manuscript is said to be single-blind reviewed if the editor knows the name and details of the author, but the reviewers don't, and double-blind if the editor doesn't know the information about the author before the decision is made either. So blind reviewing is meant to mitigate some of the biases we might have as far as gender biases or halo effect, say, based on institution, and that sort of thing, right? As well as halo effects just based on the name recognition of the author. So, first, anyone who read the article have anything they wanted to discuss about it?
How much of some of this might also be a broader-based cultural effect in the STEM areas? And unfortunately, until 51% of the population is up in Ireland, Barbie was saying that, oh, math is hard. So there is a broader-based cultural bias potentially, especially in relation to the sciences, potentially within it, especially in high academic areas.
No, that's a good point. I mean, a lot of these, especially the stereotype-based biases, are going to be sort of indexed to cultural norms, right? In a matriarchal society, presumably gender biases are going to behave much differently than they do in our society, right? And there are other issues there as well as far as access to education and those sorts of things in previous century that might contribute to our implicit biases, but on the other hand might make it look like those biases are having more of an effect than they are. And I don't know enough about the research to say exactly what's going on. So
they talked about this in STEM in the science and technology areas. Mm-hmm. Does that also translate in some ways into the other soft sciences, if you like, especially from an academic standpoint, where you're looking at tenure track and publish or perish problems and things like that?
Yeah, a lot of the issues are fairly widespread. STEM tends to get more attention, well, partly just because it gets more attention generally in our wider culture. Certainly there are problems like this analogous problems in philosophy. So, I mean, there's a massive gender disparity problem in philosophy, some of which is interestingly, in mathematics, in academic mathematics, there's pretty much gender parity among the professor and the graduate community anyway, which was not the case 20 years ago. So they've managed to find ways of mitigating the factors that were contributing to the higher proportion of men entering the discipline in ways that other sciences have not and philosophy has not yet. At the end of this article, get more back onto cognitive biases, and that's going to be on your test tomorrow. They give 6 different ways that we might mitigate gender biases in particularly the peer review process. So I'll go through them quickly and see what we think, see where they might apply and how they're going to work. So the first is, instead of feeling confident in your objectivity, before engaging in peer review, reflect on the susceptibility of all humans to bias in judgment. I mean, this is a pretty broad suggestion, covering all sorts of biases, but how do we think that might help mitigate the effect of cognitive biases? Recognizing that we're susceptible to them.
Won't really, because most biases kind of behave on a subconscious level, I think. And even, like, remember it says, even if you know you have cognitive biases, you're still susceptible to them.
Good.
They're a lot harder to like recognize because you're so used to, like, it's just your way of thinking, so you have to like take yourself out of the equation to look at what you are biased to, which is a lot harder than looking at someone else and saying what their biases are.
Right, good. So that's one of the other biases we talked about, as well as brought up. We're much better at recognizing biases in other people than we are in ourselves. But you were right as well. Just knowing that we have these biases doesn't seem to actually help us avoid them, at least not that on its own. And in fact, there's some research that shows that being aware of our cognitive biases actually makes us more susceptible to them, presumably because we think, well, I know that I think in this way, so I'm not going to do it, but you still do because it's mostly unconscious the way it's working. Yep.
But also potentially swing you into the like opposite way of being a bias. Like if you're biased against women, you know that, so you decide to be more lenient, so you end up flipping it around.
Now you're biased toward men because you favor women.
It's a possibility, definitely overcorrecting. That's why, I mean, going through some of these ways of mitigating the effect of bias, and most of them are designed to sort of separate from just mere whatever. Going the other direction. The word, apparently. It's going to be one of those days. But, yeah, the way I see this suggestion for this paper is sort of just to prime yourself and be aware of your biases so that you can then look at ways of mitigating them, other ways. So just recognize them, your biases on its own, just doing that is not going to be helpful.